Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 15, The Longbeards Conquer Italy. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Justinian had conquered much of the former Western Roman Empire, but he soon had to deal with a surprise Persian invasion in the east and a widespread epidemic. Since the empire was busy on the Eastern Front, the surviving Goths attempted to regain control of Italy, but they failed to drive out the imperial army. Moreover, Justinian was determined to gain control of Italy, so he funded a huge army that gradually conquered Italy, and the last Gothic resistance had been crushed by 562. The war for Italy had lasted a generation and had destroyed the Ostrogoth elite. In addition, the empire intervened in a civil war in Visigoth Hispania and received part of the eastern coastline, so Justinian had come close to restoring the Roman Empire. However, the exhausted imperial army in Italy barely had 6 years of rest before the Lombards swept into northern Italy in 568 to make themselves at home. Actually, the Lombards had been pushed out of their lands in the Danube region by the powerful Avar Confederacy, which in turn was fleeing the rising Turks. This game of musical chairs requires a bit of explanation. Justinian had dealt with the Avars by giving them annual subsidies, basically tribute, but cheaper than military campaigns, which enabled him to focus on Italy. The campaigns in Italy were not cheap, and the subsidies for the Avars were not small, so heavy taxes were required to pay for everything. These taxes were not popular, but people did not dare protest, since Justinian did not have a reputation for tolerance of protests. People undoubtedly remembered how he had handled the Nika riots. Justinian's last years were relatively peaceful. He was old and he preferred to bribe potential invaders to stay away. Oddly enough, despite his huge expenditure to reconquer much of the western half of the empire, he devoted little energy to integrating it into the existing empire. Yes, he sent administrators and tax collectors, but it had ceased to exist as part of the empire for generations. Work would be required to reestablish the imperial institutions, but Justinian was old, so he did nothing. Actually, that is not true. Massive wealth and energy was devoted to construction projects in the capital, as if he could only focus on something concrete in front of him. Justinian had never actually had any form of long-term strategic vision, probably because he had few real limits on his power, especially after he broke the great landowners following the Nika riots. However, Justinian died in 565, 3 years after finally conquering Italy, and he was succeeded by his nephew, Justin II. Less confident than his uncle, Justin repealed many of the unpopular taxes, so there was no money left for the subsidies. This was catastrophic news, since the Avars were a confederation of different nomad tribes that was held together only by the threat of defeat for direct opposition and the promise of shared wealth following submission. An attempt to move into Frankish territory had limited success, but the Avars failed to gain new land. So they allied with the Longbeards, better known as the Lombards, to crush the Gepids, the Lombards' rivals, in 567. Recognizing that the Avars intended to make themselves comfortable in the region, King Alboin led the Lombards into northern Italy. It may seem strange that the Lombards moved without a fight. However, they seem to have accepted that they could resist, but they would probably lose, so they moved. The Avars had humbled the Franks and then crushed the Gepids, the Lombards' ancient rivals. Conflict with the Avars would have a predictable conclusion: defeat. Wait. Wasn't Italy under the firm control of the Eastern Empire? Well, firm control might be a bit of an exaggeration, but Goth resistance had been broken. However, Justin had decided to emerge from his uncle's shadow through a glorious victory against Persia, instead of strengthening the empire's fragile hold on Italy. Since Justin had focused most of the imperial army on the Persian border, the imperial general Narses lacked enough troops to block the invasion. When the Lombards invaded Italy in the spring of 568, the imperial army was steadily driven back, and Alboin had occupied Milan by September 569. When Pavia finally surrendered after a long siege in 572, most of northern Italy was held by the Lombards. Honestly, it should not be a surprise that they had invaded Italy. Narses had finally ended Goth resistance because he had a large army, but Lombards had made up much of that army. So thousands of Lombards had seen for themselves the wealth of the region and the tenuous imperial control of Italy. Like their predecessors, the Goths, the Burgundians, and the Franks, the Lombards did not view themselves as invaders. Well, not raiders in search of loot. They wanted land, so they sent envoys to the emperor asking for their rule in Milan and Pavia to become legitimate in exchange for an alliance. Would Justin followed the example of generalissimos who had adopted a strategy of an orderly barbarian settlement? No. Okay, so presumably he would send an army to evict them from Italy? Also, no. Actually, Justin seemed to ignore the situation, so the Lombards continued to expand, taking the areas around Spoleto and Benevento while moving south towards Rome. It is unclear if Alboin could have kept the various tribes united long enough to forge a single kingdom, but it was not impossible. However, he was assassinated in 572 in a coup that appears to have been partly organized by his wife Rosamund, the daughter of the former king of the Gepids. Apparently, he had made a drinking cup from her father's skull, which must have strained the relationship. But the last straw was when he drank out of it in front of her. It may be a legend, but she did flee to Ravenna after Alboin was killed. The coup was possibly encouraged by the empire, but it was only relatively successful. Several of the more remote regions settled by Lombards declared themselves to be duchies, notably the duchies at Spoleto and Benevento. Still, the larger duchies did not fight each other, and the empire failed to send reinforcements to Italy, so the imperial forces were unable to retake northern Italy. The Eastern Roman Empire retained Sicily, the south of Italy, and a stretch of territory between Ravenna and Rome, which unintentionally would enable the autonomy of the duchies of Spoleto and Benevento. Since the prefect of Italy was based in Ravenna, far from most of the actual Roman territory, this was a strange situation. It is important to point out that imperial rule of Italy would have probably been solidified if the Lombards had not invaded. Trade with Sicily and North Africa was beneficial, while the Ostrogoths had been broken. The Visigoths in Spain were not strong enough to attack, and even the Franks had been defeated when they sent an army to aid the Goths. In the end, the Lombards proved unable to expand south, and there was no serious threat to North Africa or Sicily. Speaking of the Franks, Clothar, the youngest of Clovis's 4 sons, had outlasted his brothers to rule the United Kingdom alone for 3 years between 558 and 561. Defying the odds, Greater Frankia had been reunited into a single kingdom. This reunification process was not entirely accidental. Clovis had had 4 sons, Theodoric, Clodomar, Childebert, and Clothar. When Clodomar had died during an invasion of Burgundy, his lands were divided between Childebert and Clothar, even though he had 3 young sons. They either met unfortunate accidents or received a haircut and entered a monastery. When Childebert died, he only had 2 daughters, so his kingdom was promptly divided. However, the reunification process stalled because Theodebert managed to claim his father Theodoric's lands and even expanded them. It is a tribute to the solid foundation of Theodebert's rule that his son Theodebald smoothly inherited his father's kingdom even though he was only 13. Theodebald married Waldrada, daughter of Watho, a king of the Lombards before they conquered northern Italy. As king of Austrasia, Theodebald clearly saw the value of a marriage alliance with the Lombards who lived in the region. However, the couple had not had a child when Theodebald died in 555. The Greater Frankish kingdom had expanded by a considerable amount, although the most recent addition, Venetia, had been lost when Narses led a massive imperial army to invade Italy. Still, the kingdom of Burgundy and the region of Provence had been added to the Frankish kingdom that had been divided among 4 sons when Clovis died. Anyway, the kingdom would be divided again. As the eldest, Chadebert had Aquitaine as well as Normandy and Paris. Guntram received Burgundy, Chilperic received Nuestria, which translated as New Western Kingdom, just as Sigebert's Austrasia translated as New Eastern Kingdom. Chilperic seems to have distrusted his 3 half-brothers who shared the same mother. Moving first, he seized his father's treasury and then entered Paris, which had become the capital since the time of Clovis. His 3 brothers reacted badly and drove him out of Paris, so he ended up with the smallest kingdom. Nuestria was northeastern France and part of modern Belgium, so smaller in size than the other kingdoms of Austrasia, Aquitaine, and Burgundy. Honestly, the location was the problem, not the size of the kingdom. While the other 3 kingdoms could expand outwards, Chilperic was bordered by Brittany, the Channel, and his brothers' kingdoms. Since the terrain of Brittany was almost impossible to conquer, Chilperic had 2 options. Basically, he could build ships and try to expand into England, or he could sit back and watch his brothers expand their kingdoms outwards. I need to take a moment to explain why Chilperic was so determined to expand his kingdom. All of the kings needed to expand because a king needed to reward his nobles, who needed to reward their own armed followers, who wanted land and loot. This is not meant as a criticism of the individual nobles and their followers. Admittedly, some of them were probably ruthless and driven by an insatiable greed, but the system itself was the problem. The kings lacked the strong tax base necessary to pay regular salaries that were indexed to the cost of living with performance bonuses. Instead, they distributed land and shared loot from defeated rivals. Peaceful relations with the neighbors were impossible, since peaceful relations meant that there were no new lands or loot to distribute among your followers. To be fair, some of the kings seem to have recognized that the economic system was fundamentally flawed. Theodebert had modeled his rule on the Roman Empire and had attempted to reintroduce a land tax in his kingdom, relying on a minister named Parthenius, who had gained experience in Ravenna. Taxes are rarely popular, but this tax seems to have been hated to an astonishing degree, since Parthenius was stoned to death by a mob shortly after the king died. Anyway, Chilperic wanted to acquire more land, but he was surrounded by his brother's kingdoms and the sea, so he had no options for expansion. Actually, there was an option: expand into his brother's kingdom. He chose the latter option and raided into Austrasia. In theory, he had good timing, since Sigebert was attempting to expand into Avar territory, but he lost because Chilperic had seized the opportunity to expand his lands by taking territory from his brother. After paying the Avars to end the fighting, Sigebert then invaded and captured Chilperic's son, which convinced Chilperic to restrain his ambition, at least temporarily. While Sigebert had failed to expand east into Avar territory, he had gained a valuable royal connection in 567 when he married Brunhild, a daughter of the Visigoth king Athanagild. Although Sigebert's kingdom was merely part of the former kingdom of Frankia, it was apparently sufficiently sizable for the king of Visigoth Hispania to agree to a marriage alliance, sending his youngest daughter far, far north. It is hard to believe that either man thought that the marriage alliance would produce any tangible results, since their respective kingdoms were separated by huge distances. Still, Sigebert could hope that marriage to the daughter of the king of Hispania would elevate his status among his brothers, and Athanagild had married off a daughter to a king, rather than a noble in Hispania, who might hope to use the relationship to try to replace him. Actually, Sigebert seems to have married late. Chilperic had married quite young and already had 3 sons. However, his wife had entered a convent, possibly by choice, or possibly she had been placed in a convent run by an abbess who agreed to keep her there so that Chilperic could enjoy his relationship with his concubine Fredegund. Although technically still a slave, she had risen from kitchen slave to queen's maid to concubine. Who did the other 2 brothers marry? Chadebert was on his 3rd wife, having divorced his first wife to marry one of her servants and then married a commoner. Guntram was single but had maintained a concubine while married until their rivalry had turned deadly. Basically, until Sigebert's royal match, the sons had married for love, or more likely lust, rather than seek marriage alliances. And why should they? They were supreme in their respective kingdoms. Why would they need connections to other powerful families? Most important, who could they marry? The nearest kings were their brothers. Looking east, the neighbors were barbarian tribes. Aside from the Visigoths, Italy was controlled by the empire. Admittedly, the arrival of the Lombards in northern Italy should have provided a potential option for a marriage alliance. However, there was no Lombard king for over a decade after Alboin's murder. In fact, Sigibert's marriage alliance was strange, since Austrasia was really far from Hispania. Chadabert or Guntram would have seemed more logical, especially Chadabert, since Aquitaine bordered Visigoth Hispania, but he seemed to have no interest. The Frankish kings had likely avoided marrying powerful nobles in their kingdoms because those noble families would then have a claim to the throne and would lobby for their interests. A noble family in a neighboring kingdom would be dangerous, so they married attractive women from lower status families who could thus be discarded in favor of a younger woman. Sigebert had decided to do something different. It is important to point out that Athanagild had no sons, only 2 daughters. The eldest would be married to a powerful Visigoth family, but the youngest had been reserved for a foreign alliance. Again, there were few options, and none of the other Frankish kings appeared to have made the offer, so Sigebert's proposal was accepted. The situation changed dramatically around the time of Sigebert's marriage. Chadabert, the eldest brother, was nearly 50, but he had failed to produce an heir after 3 wives. Apparently, the 3rd wife was the teenage daughter of a shepherd. Presumably, she appeared fertile. Although she gave birth to a son, the baby died soon after the birth, a victim of one of the many diseases of the time. So Chadabert married again, choosing the sister of his 2nd wife, although he had to remove her from her nunnery first. The church was pretty relaxed about divorce at the time, but marrying a former spouse's sibling was considered incestuous, and worse, she was a nun. Still, Chadabert was determined and staged a ceremony to celebrate his kingship with a poet lauding him as a modern Caesar. Hopefully, the ceremony would impress the bishops. Anyway, the church was a weak institution divided by the schism between the Catholic or Nicene Christianity and the Homoian Christians. It would be nice if the bishops blessed the marriage, but their permission was not required. Unknown to Chadabert, his admittedly scandalous marriage was part of a larger problem. The church was busy trying to stop bishops from marrying and leaving their considerable wealth to their children, rather than the church. In addition, the church was trying to stop monks and nuns from marrying, so Chadabert's marriage did not help the situation. When the bishops met in November 567, they tried to persuade the king to end his marriage. When he refused, he became the first king in Europe to be excommunicated. Worse, his wife soon died in a particularly severe epidemic. Not long after, Chadabert died of a heart attack while hunting, likely caused at least partially by stress over the lack of an heir and an annoying spat with the bishops. To sum up, the newly reunited Roman Empire suffered a setback when the Lombards conquered much of Italy. Since Justinian's successor Justin was preoccupied with a war against the Persian Empire, the imperial forces in Italy were unable to retake the lands lost to the Lombards. Meanwhile, Clothar had outlasted his brothers, nephew, and even his grand-nephew to reunite Greater Frankia into a single kingdom. When he died 3 years later, the kingdom was divided once again among his 4 sons. However, unlike their father's generation, the younger generation of Frankish kings would prove to be less united. In particular, Chilperic, the youngest brother, would repeatedly invade his brother's kingdom of Austrasia in an attempt to expand his lands. An opportunity appeared when Chadabert, the eldest brother, died without an heir. So, who would inherit his kingdom? I will answer that question next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.